Brenner Vale was stacking river slate against the inside wall of his cabin when Gideon Rusk stopped at the doorway and watched in silence. Slate after slate, heavy, flat, cold, the kind of work a desperate man chose when easier work had already failed. Gideon had buried neighbors, hauled freight through whiteouts, and seen winter strip strong men down to prayer. He looked at the growing wall, then at the two children near the stove. Jonah, 10, pretending not to be afraid. Elsie, 6, wrapped in a blanket too thin for the season ahead. Then he gave his judgment. When your fire dies, those children will freeze before that stone learns mercy. Brenner said nothing. He only set another slab in place and packed clay into the seam with his thumb. He was a widower with 2 young children, less than 2 cords of poor wood, and no good mule left to haul more. The strongest animal he owned had vanished with the one relative who promised to help him through winter. So he was doing what sensible men did not do. He was teaching walls to hold heat. If stories of hard-earned wisdom, frontier grit, and practical survival mean something to you, subscribe and stay with this one. Because 6 weeks after Gideon Rusk spoke those words, the Black Ridge blizzard would erase every road on the prairie. And before it was done, one cabin would answer a question the whole valley had judged already settled. To understand why he kept stacking stone after that warning, it helped to know what had been left to him. 4 months earlier, Brenner Vale came into Red Elk Draw with his wife Clara, their son Jonah, their daughter Elsie, and a wagon that looked fuller than their future was. The cabin waiting there measured 11 by 14 feet. The roof sagged. The chinking had failed in places. Wind could be heard before it was felt, but it was land, walls, and a start. On the frontier, that was often enough to call hope. Then early summer turned hard. Clara went into labor too soon. The child never lived. Fever came after. Infection followed. By the 3rd day, the room was quiet in the way rooms become when death has decided to stay. When it was over, Brenner stood with what remained. Jonah, 10 years old. Elsie, 6. A patched cabin. Debt at the mercantile. 1 mule fit for hauling wood. A small box of wheelwright tools from work he used to know. No sermon changed it. No neighbor could carry it for him. He did not cry where anyone could see. He stripped the bed, folded Clara's shawl, and set it away. He fed the children. He checked the mule's tether. Then, after dark, he added a second bar across the cabin door. That was how some men grieved. Not with sound, with work. Work kept the cabin moving, but work could not watch 2 children at once, cook, mend, haul water, and cut fuel. That was where Ruth Vale entered the picture. Clara's older sister arrived with soft words, steady hands, and the kind of sympathy tired people want to believe. She said she would stay through harvest season, then through the first winter if needed. She cooked for the children, swept the floor, and spoke of Clara as if loyalty still lived in the family. For a short time, Brenner allowed himself to trust what remained. Then, one morning he returned from the creek with 2 pails of water and saw the truth before he reached the door. The hitch post stood bare. No mule, no saddle harness, no trace of Ruth. Inside, the small tin cash box lay open, not emptied, but lightened. Enough taken to matter. Enough left behind to feel deliberate. A folded scrap of paper sat on the table. I chose a life that can still be lived. That was all. No apology. No promise to return. No mention of Clara. Jonah read the room before he read the note. Elsie asked where Aunt Ruth had gone, then asked where the mule had gone, then stopped asking. Brenner stepped back outside and stared at the empty post. He knew exactly what had been taken. Without that mule, there would be no timber runs, no hauling green loads home to dry, no winter by the usual methods. Some thefts take money. Others take the path that money would have needed. The loss of the mule did not stay private for long. On the frontier, weakness traveled faster than wagons. A few days later, Gideon Rusk came up the path and asked no permission to judge what he saw. He moved through the cabin in silence, reading roof, floor, seams, and woodpile, with the cold certainty of a man who had seen winter finish weaker houses. He looked up first. Roof draft, heat escaping before it could matter. He looked down next. Frost heave gaps along the floorboards, where cold would creep in low and stay there. He pressed a thumb into loose chinking and pulled dust from the seam. Then he walked outside to the woodpile and split one round with Brenner's maul, green cottonwood, heavy with water, slow to burn. Poor heat. He came back in and asked the only number that mattered. How much wood? Brenner answered plainly. About 1.6 cords. Gideon nodded once, not in approval. In confirmation, 5 to pass decent winter, 6 to pass it safer. He glanced at the walls. This place eats fuel like a pit. Jonah stood still near the stove. Elsie watched Gideon the way children watch men who speak like judges. Gideon did not raise his voice. Men like him never needed to. Sell the claim to Silas Vane while there's still weather enough to move. Take the children into town. Pride burns fast. Wood burns faster. Brenner said nothing. Gideon rested his knuckles once against the cabin wall, as if measuring the thinness of mercy itself. Then he gave the sentence only experience can speak. Winter isn't weather here, it's selection. Gideon's warning did not turn Brenner stubborn for the sake of pride. It turned him practical. Before a man rejects the old way, he first tries to make it work. So for 3 weeks, Brenner chased fuel by every method poorer men had always known. He dragged deadfall home by hand, one branch at a time, rope biting into his palms. He twisted prairie grass tight and bound it into crude bundles that flared fast and died faster. He walked to the rail siding and gathered fallen coal chips from the dirt where better fortunes had spilled them. He split green cottonwood into smaller sticks and stacked them near the stove, hoping heat might hurry dryness. Jonah went with him when the miles were short enough for a boy. He filled pockets with coal chips and tried not to limp on the walk back. Elsie stayed inside more often now. At night her cough came thin through the dark. The pile beside the cabin rose, but only by inches. Brenner knew how to read volume the way other men read scripture. He measured armloads, weight, burn time, waste. At the end of the 3rd week, he stood over everything he had gathered. Then he did the math again. The answer had not changed. Some labors fail honestly. They give all they can, and still come up short. The arithmetic did not break him. It cornered him. And cornered men sometimes notice what comfortable men ignore. One bitter night, Brenner set a flat piece of river slate across the kettle lid because the handle had loosened and would not sit right. It was a small, ugly fix. The kind poor houses lived on. An hour later, the fire had dropped to a red bed of coals. The iron stove was already losing itself to the cold. Its sides cooled fast. The room changed with it. Air that had felt livable a short while earlier now bit at the nose and ears. Elsie coughed in her sleep. Jonah turned beneath a blanket and pulled it tighter. Brenner lifted the kettle aside and reached for the slate. He expected cold. It was still warm, not hot, not enough to boast about, but undeniably warm. Warm after the iron had begun surrendering. Warm after the room had started turning mean again. He set his palm on it longer this time, said nothing, tested it the way a craftsman tests grain or balance. Then memory moved before words did. Years earlier, in a wheelwright shop 2 counties east, there had been stone flooring laid near the forge. Long after the coal bed dimmed, those slabs kept a mild heat in them. Apprentices stood there in winter without thinking why. Brenner looked at the stove, then at the cabin walls, then at the thin air that never stayed where it was paid to stay. The stove heats air. The air escapes. His eyes settled on the slate in his hand. What if it heated stone instead? Nothing in the room changed yet. The cold was still there. The debt was still there. Winter was still coming. But something had shifted inside the man staring at that wall. Fatigue had left his face. Calculation had taken its place. By first light, Brenner was walking toward North Fork Creek with a rope, a pry bar, and a purpose he did not yet trust enough to name. He came back with 4 flat slabs of slate, each heavy enough to matter and smooth enough to stack. He set them near the stove through the afternoon, turning them once, letting the heat work into them slowly instead of striking only the surface. After supper, he slid the stones beneath the children's bed frame and said nothing about why. Frontier houses had no room for experiments announced too early. That night, Brenner did not truly sleep. He woke to measure what hope looked like in darkness. At midnight, he knelt and reached beneath the bed. The slate was still warm. Near 2 o'clock, he checked again. Cooler now, but losing heat slowly, like a man who refuses to quit all at once. At dawn, he touched them a 3rd time. No warmth worth bragging on. Yet not dead cold either. Not the hard, punishing chill bare floorboards gave back before morning. He stood and listened. No coughing from Elsie. No restless turning from Jonah. Just the deep, even breathing of children who had slept through the night for the first time in weeks. Brenner looked at the bed, then at the stove, then at the empty walls around him. The idea was no longer only an idea. Once a man begins changing a house, neighbors begin asking why. When the changes involve hauling stone instead of wood, they ask sooner. Mara Kit, the nearest neighbor, came over near sundown carrying a jar of saved drippings and the blunt honesty that made her useful. She had raised children through 3 hard winters and trusted no idea that could not survive a cold floor and an empty shelf. She stood inside the cabin while Brenner showed her the marks he had made in charcoal. Slate along the north wall. More stone wrapped around the stove corner where heat struck first. A low bench built thick with mass so Jonah and Elsie could sleep where warmth lasted longest. Mara listened without interrupting. Then she began dismantling the plan the way practical people do piece by piece. Cold stone steals heat first, she said. You know that. Brenner nodded. He did. You line these walls, this room gets smaller. Smaller room means tighter misery if you're wrong. He nodded again. She tapped the stove with 1 finger. And if you don't keep enough fire in this iron box to charge all that stone, you won't have a warm cabin. You'll have an ice house you built yourself. The children were quiet enough to hear every word. Jonah looked at the floor. Elsie held her blanket at the chin. Brenner did not defend the plan with speeches. He looked around the room exactly as it was. Thin walls, poor wood, cold already waiting its turn. I am already living in the losing version. Mara had no quick answer for that. She stood there a long moment, measuring the truth of it against everything she knew. At the door, she set down the jar of drippings. If you collapse out by the creek, she said, I'll come check on the children. Then she went home, leaving doubt behind her and something close to respect beside it. Practical doubt was one kind of pressure. Profit was another. It arrived 2 days later in a polished wagon with clean wheels and a man who dressed as if mud belonged to other people. Silas Vane stepped down smiling before he reached the door. He was known for helping families in hard positions, which was frontier language for buying what trouble had weakened. His coat was brushed. His boots were dry. Even his sympathy looked recently polished. He admired nothing in the cabin, yet insulted nothing directly. Men like Silas preferred their knives wrapped in manners. He spoke gently. Brenner had children. Winter was near. Debt sat at the mercantile. Town had rooms to rent, odd work to be found, schools when weather allowed. There was no shame in beginning again. Then he named the price. $38 for the claim. Enough to clear what was owed. Enough to move while roads still held. Enough, he implied, for a sensible man to accept. His eyes drifted to the growing pile of slate outside the wall. He chuckled softly. Rocks are honest things, he said. They stay cold, Brenner answered with 1 word. No. Silas did not bristle. Predators rarely waste emotion on first refusals. He buttoned his gloves instead. I'll come again when the first wind turns, he said. By then the offer will be smaller. Need usually does that. He climbed back into the wagon and drove off at an easy pace. Certain time worked for him. Brenner said nothing after the wheels faded. He looped rope through the nose of the crude sled he had built from planks and scrap iron, leaned into the pull, and started for North Fork Creek. When he passed the last place where the wagon tracks still showed, he did not look back. Silas believed need would grow stronger with time. What he did not understand was that some men grow harder at the same rate. Brenner entered the heaviest season of labor he had ever known. Each morning began before light. He stirred the stove back to life, warmed what little breakfast there was, and made sure the children had heat before he took any for himself. Then he dragged the empty sled 2 miles to North Fork Creek, empty going out, punishing coming back. There he learned quickly that stone had its own lies. Black slabs were not always the best. Smooth faces meant little. Weight mattered. Density mattered. A sharp ring under iron meant more than appearance ever would. He loaded what deserved the pull and left what only looked useful. Then he leaned into the rope and hauled it home through shoulder-high wind. Days turned his hands from torn skin to hard knots. His shoulders swelled. His back stiffened until standing straight became morning work of its own. Slowly, the cabin changed. The north wall rose to knee height in slate. The stove corner thickened to twice its former mass. A low bench began taking shape beside the warm side of the room. Each week, that stove corner held heat a little longer after the fire dropped. Brenner noticed and said nothing. Jonah began slipping smaller stones onto the sled when he thought his father would not see. The first time, Brenner took them off and carried them back. The second time, he let them stay. Some boys become useful all at once. Others by ounces. The wall was rising, but instinct alone can only carry a man so far. Craft must meet it somewhere. One gray morning in early November, Brenner was kneeling at North Fork Creek, sorting slate into 2 piles, when a woman's voice sounded behind him. "You're carrying the pretty ones." He turned and saw Sarah Thorne, an older widow from the far end of Red Elk Draw, known for keeping a stove alive on less fuel than seemed possible. She was old in the hard frontier way, lean, weather-cut, and upright by force of will more than comfort. Her eyes missed little and forgave less. She did not ask permission to judge the piles. She nudged one slab with her boot. Color means nothing. She lifted another with both hands, then handed it to him. Weight means something. She tapped a third with the butt of a hammer. It answered with a dull clack. She tossed it aside. Then she struck another. It rang sharp and clean. "That one stays," she explained as if speaking to someone who ought to keep up. Soft slate cracks when heat and cold take turns at it. Dense stone stores longer, breaks slower, earns the trouble of hauling. Brenner listened without defending the loads he had already dragged home. Sarah followed him back to the cabin and walked the room in silence. She studied the north wall, the stove corner, the half-built bench, the careless gaps where clay had not reached deep enough. At last, she faced him. The principle is sound. Her eyes moved across the crooked courses and uneven bearing lines. The workmanship is desperate. Brenner did not argue. Men who truly want to learn rarely waste time protecting pride. He only asked the useful question. What would you change first? Brenner had asked the right question, and Sarah Thorne respected useful questions enough to answer them. She came back the next day, and the day after that, and for 3 weeks besides. She taught without softness and without waste. Empty spaces behind the stone were not harmless gaps. They were places where cold could live. So she made him force clay mixed with ash deep into every void. Joints were never to rise in straight lines. They must stagger, or the wall would think like separate pieces instead of one body. Lower courses had to lean slightly inward so the weight settled toward safety, not away from it. Where the stove threw its strongest heat, the mass must be thickest. Where children slept, the bench had to touch the heat path, not sit beside it pretending closeness was enough. Then she turned to the stove itself and corrected the mistake most people called common sense. Big flames heat air, coals heat mass. She had Brenner split wood smaller, feed often, Keep the coal bed steady for 4 straight hours instead of roaring hot for 1 and starving the next 3. Flame looked impressive. Coals did the work that lasted. By the second week, Brenner understood something bitter. He had been burning wrong for years, like many men before him. He had heated rooms quickly and lost them quickly. One dawn, after following Sarah's method through the night, he laid a hand on the bench. It still carried warmth. Not comfort enough for boasting, but real warmth at first light. Sarah noticed his expression and looked away before it could become gratitude. "My boy died in a cabin that was warm until midnight," she said. "That was all. No story, no tears, no sermon." Then she pointed at the stove. "Feed it. The wall remembers only what you give it." For a time, the cabin answered better each week. That was when danger changed shape. Early success can make a man trust what has not yet been fully tested. At the start of December, sometime past midnight, Brenner woke to a sound no builder ever mistakes. A low grinding shift, stone under strain. Then came the drop. The heat bench beside the stove slid forward half an inch. One support course cracked. 2 upper slabs tipped loose and slammed onto the floorboards. Elsie jerked awake and cried out. Jonah was already standing before his eyes had fully opened. Brenner was at the bench in 2 strides. He saw the truth immediately. 3 weeks of labor balanced wrong. Weight pushing where it had no business going. If the lower line failed completely, the whole bench could peel apart. Outside, winter had already begun in earnest. There was no spare month left for elegant repairs. No spare wood for mistakes. No spare strength in the house at all. He said nothing, because there was nothing useful to say. He only steadied the loose slabs with both hands and felt how close effort can come to becoming rubble. Sarah arrived after sunrise, as if trouble had sent for her before anyone else could. She crouched, studied the crack, traced the bearing line with one finger, then stood. "Good idea," she said. "Bad load path." She gave the remedy at once. Fence posts for braces. Wedges driven downward to force pressure back into the wall. Crude timber under fine stone. Ugly, but fast. Then she looked toward the road. "Send for Gideon Rusk." Brenner glanced at her. "You need strength," she said. "And men listen harder when the doubter carries lumber." Sarah had been right about one thing beyond argument. Men who doubt an idea often trust it more once they have to lift part of it. Gideon Rusk arrived the next afternoon with a wagon loaded, not with compliments, but with lumber no one else wanted. Old fence posts, wagon tongues split at the ends, warped beams weathered silver by years outdoors. Useful wood, if a man cared more for strength than appearances. He climbed down, set the brake, and began unloading without offering apology or commentary. Brenner took the far end of the first beam. That was greeting enough between them. Together they carried the timber inside. Gideon stopped once and looked around the cabin. The slate walls now rose nearly to shoulder height along the north side. The stove corner stood thick and deliberate. Even half broken, the bench showed intention. "I did not think you'd still be here," he said. Brenner shifted his grip on the beam. Neither did the wind. Something close to approval passed through Gideon's face and disappeared before it could settle. He checked Sarah's brace plan, drove wedges with the back of a maul, and helped force the bench tight against the load it had tried to escape. Crude supports, solid result. By dusk, the structure held firmer than before. When he was ready to leave, Gideon rested one hand on the rebuilt bench and tested its steadiness. Then he looked at Brenner, not as a fool, not yet as an equal, but no longer as a dead man walking. After the first real blizzard, he said, "I'll come see what truth looks like." After Gideon left, the work no longer felt like improvisation. It felt like design. By the middle of December, Brenner's cabin had stopped being a patched shelter and become a system with rules of its own. The stove corner carried the thickest slate, where radiant heat struck hardest. The north wall rose nearly to a grown man's shoulder, guarding the side winter favored most. The children's bench stood rebuilt and braced with rough fence post timber. Part of the east wall, once the first place to frost white, now wore thinner stone backed with clay and ash. Deep seams had been packed tight enough that the mass behaved less like stacked slabs and more like one body. Brenner no longer burned fire merely to see flame. He fired early, held steady coals by noon, deepened the charge through late afternoon, and banked the stove with discipline at night. The room had grown smaller by nearly a third, yet what remained no longer betrayed him so quickly. Mornings were still cold, but not knife cold. Jonah no longer camped against the stove from sundown onward. Elsie woke with less damp chill in her blankets. The bench often held warmth longer than the iron stove, once the flames fell low. Even the north corner had stopped feeling like a place built for suffering. Sarah Thorne came once more before Christmas. She walked the room slowly, laying a hand on stone the way other people read books. "The stone is ready," she said. "That does not mean you are safe. It means the house will now answer the way it was built to answer." Then she gave the harder warning. Stone was not fuel. Stone was not mercy. Stone only kept what discipline gave it. Christmas passed without presents. Flour stretched thinner. Lamp oil was counted by spoon. Wood by armful. The children slept on the bench because tomorrow's warmth stayed there longest. Brenner asked no grand questions anymore. Only one remained. When the real storm came, would the walls still be giving after the fire could not? January began with a kindness too neat to trust. The sun showed itself. Old snow softened at the edge of the porch. Jonah asked if there might be time that afternoon to split the thinner sticks outside. Brenner did not believe in weather that smiled for no reason, but even he did not see how fast the blow would fall. Near noon, the wind changed direction. Light thinned. Distance outside the door seemed to shorten, as if something unseen were dragging the horizon closer. By early afternoon, the cold began to drop. Not slowly, not evenly. It came like a giant door had opened somewhere beyond Black Ridge. Within hours, the temperature fell 62 degrees. Snow no longer drifted down. It moved sideways. The prairie disappeared. Every shape beyond the window was erased. Brenner shifted the cabin into siege work at once. Blankets over the largest seams, rags driven into frame cracks. The children's bedding pulled tight against the heat bench. Reserve wood stacked within arm's reach. Smaller split sticks fed often, not in bursts, to keep the coal bed steady. He did not burn hotter from panic. He remembered Sarah Thorne. The wall does not care about panic. It cares about hours. Until dusk, the system answered as it had been taught. The stove corner ran hot. The north wall warmed through. The bench kept giving back what the day had stored. Jonah and Elsie were less cold than the old cabin would ever have allowed. But storms do not test one point. They test all points. By full dark, the east side began to fail first. Its thinner stone and broken coverage started handing winter into the room inch by inch. Brenner dragged his last spare slabs into place along the base, not to win, only to make the cold move slower. Elsie began to shiver hard enough to shake the blanket. Jonah grew quiet in the way children do when fear becomes too real for questions. Both of them felt what every frontier family feared most. A house can turn from shelter to trap in a single night. Brenner kept feeding the stove in measured rhythm, as if he were keeping heartbeat inside the walls while everything outside tried to stop it. After midnight, the Black Ridge blizzard no longer sounded like wind. It became pressure. Continuous, deliberate pressure against every weak place a house could have. Near 12 o'clock, Brenner smelled the first new danger. Smoke moving wrong. Not the clean pull of a healthy draft, but smoke being forced back down. The chimney cap had twisted under the gale. Downdraft was driving into the flue. Sparks spat back through the stove seams. Gray smoke began to roll low across the room. A stone-lined cabin could hold warmth longer. It could also hold poison longer. Brenner dropped beside the children at once. He pushed them low to the floor, wrapped damp cloth over their mouths, and told them not to rise unless he touched them. Then he opened the door and went into white. There was no world outside now, only wind, frozen wood beneath his hand, direction remembered by the body. He moved along the wall log by touch, not sight. His gloves stiffened, breath cut his throat like metal. He found the chimney by memory, climbed half by instinct, seized the cap, and forced it back into line. He held it there until the seal caught true. When he came inside again, his lungs burned raw. But the draw had returned. Smoke began climbing where smoke belonged. Then came the slower enemy, fuel. No system makes wood from nothing. By 3 a.m, the reserve pile was nearly gone. The last coal pan dimmed red at the edges. Air inside the cabin turned thin and bitter. Bare floorboards glittered white with frost. Now the idea itself stood trial. Brenner touched the stove iron. Still a little heat. He touched the north wall. Warmer than the room. He touched the bench. Warmest of all. He touched the east boards. Dead cold. The difference was no theory now. It lived under his hand. He pulled Jonah and Elsie tight against the bench and wrapped the blankets around all 3 of them so their backs and sides could drink the heat the slate had gathered through the day. Jonah spoke softly through the dark. "When the fire is gone, is that when people lose?" Brenner answered with the truest thing he knew. "That's when you find out what the house remembers." The coals withdrew little by little. Outside, the blizzard roared at the walls. Inside, the cabin was no longer warm in any comfortable sense. But the slate kept giving back what it had been given. Slowly, sparingly, honestly. And that small, honest warmth was the line between life and death. Morning arrived like an object with no heart in it. Brenner woke into gray light and the silence that follows a night of violence. The stove was dead. The window had gone white with ice. Every bare surface in the room carried frost. He sat up slowly. The first things he checked were not the door or the weather. Jonah was breathing. Elsie was breathing. And the bench had not gone hard cold. He laid his palm on the slate. It was no longer warm in any comforting sense, but it was not as cold as the room. It still stood a little above the air, still on the side of Mayol on the side of life. Mayer understood what that meant, without needing words. Then the outside world began entering the cabin through those who had survived it. Sarah Thorne came first, ice crusted along her scarf, wearing the face of someone who had crossed a country whose population had changed overnight. She offered no congratulations. She inspected the children, the stove, the wall temperature, the bench surface, the frost lines on the bare boards. Then she gave the valley's first accounting. The Harper place had more wood than Brenner ever did, but they burned in bursts and slept on a fast-cooling floor. By dawn, Harper and his oldest boy were gone. The Leland house was tighter built, newer boards, fewer drafts. But once their fuel dropped, the air inside turned killing cold before 2 a.m. At Miller's place, no one died, but the twins lost flesh in their feet because the sleeping corner froze hard before sunrise. More wood had not been enough. Tighter walls had not been enough. A bigger stove had not been enough. Brenner had lived because his cabin did not die when the fire did. Sarah looked around once more and spoke almost to herself. It answered slow enough. Gideon Rusk arrived later. He walked the room exactly as he had months before, but this time he searched for no weakness. He read evidence: clay-packed joints, thick stove-side mass, bench depth, the east shield where winter had been delayed, if not denied. On the road in, he had seen houses with full woodsheds, beaten before dawn. New cabins that lost heat the moment flames fell. One man had burned furniture by midnight and still could not keep warmth for his children. He looked at Brenner for a long moment. "I judged the size of your fire," he said. "You judged the life of what came after it." It was a true apology, because it asked for nothing back. Brenner did not enjoy being right. He only looked at the 2 children still sleeping. For men like him, victory was measured in breathing. Breathing was proof enough for Brenner. For other men, proof often needed an audience. A few days later, when the road cut began to open again, Silas Vane returned. Not to help, to do what he did best. He came to rearrange reality until it could be sold. He spoke in the careful tone of a reasonable man. Luck had its place. Neighbors had come through. Shared fuel after the storm might have saved anyone. Stone walls made a fine story, but stories were not proof. It was a shrewd frontier move. He did not deny the thing outright. He only thinned the cause until it lost its shape. If Brenner could not hold the lesson, then the lesson could not change the price of land, labor, or respect. But this time Brenner was not standing alone inside doubt. Gideon was there. Sarah was there. Mara Kitt was there. And beside her stood Elias Kitt, her broad-shouldered husband, a fence builder who trusted only what he could lift, measure, or watch survive winter. They heard every word. And once witnesses hold the same truth, a smooth lie has less room to walk. Gideon answered first. Harper had more wood. Leland had tighter walls. Miller had more room and better boards. None of it mattered once the heat vanished too fast. Sarah added the sharper correction. Stone alone had not saved Brenner. Correct mass had, correct firing had, correct placement had. The difference was not luck. It was method. Silas found no opening after that. He was not shouted down. He was simply left with no place to stand. He went away without drama, but he went away stripped of the right to call Brenner foolish again. Then the valley began to learn. Elias Kitt was the first man to drag a sled to North Fork for slate instead of firewood. Others followed. Child benches appeared beside stove walls. North corners thickened with river stone. Sleeping alcoves became heat pockets. Clay and ash sat in buckets beside more than one stove. Brenner never lectured. He taught with his hands. Pick the dense ones. Listen for the ring. Do not line up the joints. Make the weight fall inward. Do not burn for flame. Burn for hours. Mara Kitt, who had once called it an ice house waiting to happen, now told mothers to put their children where the mass stayed warm longest. Jonah learned how to strike slate and hear the difference. Elsie called the bench the wall bed. Brenner took no payment for any of it, not because he wished to look noble, but because that knowledge had already been paid for in split hands, a broken back, the fear of losing his children, and one night when the fire nearly left before morning did. On the frontier, many people believed survival belonged to the family with the biggest woodpile. Brenner Vale learned something harder and costlier than that. Warmth that dies fast is only delay. Warmth that lingers becomes a second chance. And after that winter, Red Elk Draw did not only count wood anymore. It began counting walls that remembered heat. Do you think Brenner Vale was brave, desperate, or simply smarter than everyone who laughed at those stone walls?